Simpson. I'm Head of Quality in Early Years Settings at the Department for Education, and I had started by saying a big thank you to everybody for all that you've been doing during COVID, and I think that bears repeating, even if you did hear me say it before, because I think that is really important. What I had just started to do was to talk a bit about where the reforms to the early years foundation stage had come from, with the roots back in the primary assessment consultation, and really taking things that teachers and practitioners and early years experts had and primary experts had said that they wanted to be different in how things are done. So this has been a long process since then, and thanks to all those who contributed to the development of where we are now. I had mentioned that we're really grateful that the early adopters have felt able to proceed with reforms during this year ahead of statutory rollout next year, and I've just recapped also on the key outcomes that we want to see from doing these reforms. And those are very much to improve outcomes for all children, particularly in early language and particularly for disadvantaged children. And the other key aim is to really change some of the and reduce some of the workload burdens, particularly those that are around paperwork collection, tracking, data collection, and so on, which we don't feel are the things that really make the difference for children in early years. There will be support available for early adopters during this year. Some of that has already started. We had already started some of the support for local authorities as well, because we realise how important it is to also be having these types of conversations directly with local authorities, and making sure that as much as possible we have shared expectations about things. So one of the key things I really wanted to respond to today, and it's been a question about that we've had in DFE, and perhaps others have had too, about the reforms and about the new development matters that was published at the start of September. And that's been around what expectations the Department for Education has about tracking and data collection. So I wanted to say really clearly that we in the Department for Education don't have any expectation that during reception year that schools will need to be tracking and giving predictions throughout that year on where they think children will be at the end of the year. What's really important to us is that there's that focus on curriculum, practice and teaching, and people being able to use their professional judgment in making the right decisions to support children in their development and their learning. And then at the end of the year, the EYFS profile assessment should take place. And we feel that that's enough to give, to support that transition as children move from reception year into year one, and that there shouldn't need to be more in between. We don't expect, and we haven't asked local authorities to need to collect more information than that. So that's one of the things I really wanted to say, and I think it will be a bit of a focus in today's session. If we move on to the next slide, I also just wanted to say thank you, a few things about the new development matters. This remains non-statutory curriculum guidance, but it does support and align with the revised EYFS. This was created over an 18-month period with extensive input from early years practitioners, so it has been quite a process developing it. It's something for the early adopters to use during this year, but it doesn't replace the current document until the reforms are nationally rolled out from September 21. So if that helps clarify any confusion for anybody who's not an early adopter and was unsure. During this year, we would like to have feedback from you as early adopter schools in terms of implementation of the reforms. The policy themselves itself and the EYFS itself is as published for the early adopters and will be republished for national rollout next year without the early adopter badge on it, and that will remain set. But what we do have is room to gather feedback in terms of implementation that could support people, perhaps things that we could make clearer. For instance, if there are gaps in development matters that need to be addressed, then we are keen to hear feedback and we'll do what we can to make things clearer and to strengthen them. I think those were the key things I wanted to say really, and I'm sure some of that might be repeated as we go through the session.
Thank you so much, Ada. So in one moment, I'm going to hand over to Wendy Ratcliff HMI and Phil Minns HMI from Ofsted. But I think just to be absolutely clear about some of those messages from the DFE, first of all, a huge thank you to all of the early adopters, and we're all learning together at the moment. So keeping in touch with you, learning with you, finding out what's working, but also what's proving difficult. That's going to be really valuable. And secondly, just to say that if local authorities are asking for data to be submitted about children on entry to reception, that is not something that the Department for Education recommends local authorities to request from schools. It's important that, again, we're all learning together here to try and reduce workload and unnecessary burdens on schools, especially at this time. So that collaboration with Ada and the team at the DFE will be really valuable. Now, a lot of the questions that have come up on the Facebook group have been around Ofsted inspection. So I'm really delighted to hand over to Wendy and to Phil. Thank you so much for joining us.
Phil and I are really pleased to be able to join you this afternoon. And I think it's important to echo again what Julian and Ada have already said around recognising the efforts that you've made during this pandemic, and those efforts that you continue to make, and for signing up to be early adopters. One of the things that, as Julian says, we do get asked a lot is, but what will Ofsted want to see? What do we need to do for Ofsted? And actually, we just want to spend a few minutes just thinking about that in terms of, assessment and Ofsted's view on what that assessment is, and just a reminder about what we do look for on inspection. But before we do that, just over to Phil, and he will just tell you a little bit about what we're actually doing this term.
Yeah, and it's worth just saying that, of course, we'll be talking about what we would expect to see on inspection, but at the moment we're not doing inspections, and that's in recognition of the current situation that everyone's in. And we all know, we would recognise the difficult time sometimes that this can be in reception anyway, when you're welcoming all those new children and trying to get them settled in. We've been there. We know what joy and challenge that can be, and also that this at the moment that's even more so. You'll have children, I'm sure, who haven't even been able to do visits to the school, where you haven't been able to carry out that usual practice of getting them used to it and you getting to know them before they start. So we recognise all of those things. The plans for this term is that we don't do routine inspection in schools. Those routine inspections remain suspended until January. And instead, we're doing a programme of interim visits. And what the purpose of those is sort of twofold, really. The part of it is about visiting the school and hearing what's going on in the school and providing some sort of opportunity for the school to tell us what's going on. But also that results in a letter, but there's no judgments in there. We're not making any judgments. That's very much about just explaining what the school has chosen to do and how it's dealing with things at the moment. And it's not a judgment on what happened during lockdown either. And the other purpose of that visit is actually to start getting information back out into the sector about what are the big challenges schools are facing, how they might be choosing to tackle those challenges, and to sort of start trying to provide some information back into not only into the sector but also to the Department for Education and others about what's happening in schools at the moment. So it's trying to be sort of support the recovery process. So those visits, like I said, are not inspections. So we're not inspecting at the moment. But if we do start to go back to the new inspection framework, which we introduced last September, the Education Inspection Framework, EYF, this slide is just a reminder of some of the key messages there, which hopefully will support some of the questions that I know Julian's been telling us have come up. So there is a real important reason behind the changes that we've made, and these are them. The first one there is about the accountability system diverting providers from the real substance of education, and that's something that we know to a certain extent has been contributed to by the inspection framework as well. So that's one of the reasons for change. but it's also trying to redress that and move away from people seeing the data as being the purpose of education. So for, in the early years, a good level of development is not the purpose of those children's education. It is an assessment which is carried out at a certain point. But actually what we're interested in, and what our inspectors would be interested in when we return to routine inspection, is actually what's going on for these children. To what extent is there a rich, broad curriculum which is helping them to learn all the stuff that they need to learn, not only to do well in reception, but also as they learn and grow over time. Really making sure that the time they spend in the reception year sets them up for their whole education. The next slide is sort of summarizes that, I suppose, in a way. Actually, the previous one, I think. That. Oh, there we go.
Stop, hit the target.
Excellent, that's it. And this is just the one that we use. It's a sort of shorthand, really, thinking about the problems of narrowing the curriculum. And what we end up doing is hitting the target but missing the point. And people, when we think about narrowing the curriculum, often people will think about that happening at sort of a GCSE level where, children are studying for their exams and they narrow down what they learn to try and get a C grade or the old C grade rather than anything else. But we get exactly the same thing in the foundation stage, where people might be narrowing the curriculum for some children because they're heading towards GLD. And that can sometimes, it might mean that child gets GLD, but perhaps they haven't had the real focus that they need, particularly on prime areas of learning, which are actually the things that will make the difference for them in their success later on. Their ability to have positive relationships, to feel good about themselves, be able to start and finish an activity, to have the vocabulary and the understanding of the vocabulary that they need in their language and communication. But to narrow the curriculum just so they simply get what they need in writing so that they get GLD might hit the target, as in it might get us a level of GLD percentage pass rate that we want, but actually for that child doesn't really work and it can miss the point. And that's a consistent message that we put across in all of the areas that we inspect in every level of schools. That it's about what do those children need. It's about the true genuine curriculum that they are learning. It's not simply about whether they achieve a certain level at a certain point. The next slide is just a reminder of what the Early Years Foundation stage says about assessment. And this is also something that's driven quite a lot of the work that we've done in this new framework to reduce the workload often associated with assessment in the early years. I don't know, Wendy, feel free to butt in if there's stuff here that I'm missing.
No, absolutely. You were on a roll there. And I think it's, those words in bold on this slide are really, really important. And, there isn't that, assessment shouldn't require that excessive amount of paperwork, and it should be limited to that is absolutely necessary. Let's not take your time away from spending, there's key interactions with children because you need to be filling in some kind of tick sheet assessment, because that's not required.
Yeah, we've been really clear on that, haven't we? That we think that we know that what the youngest children benefit from most is high quality interaction with an adult. And if an assessment workload is so great that it's taking you away from that, then actually that's not doing those children, that's not serving those children's best interests. It's not giving them the education they need. And it comes back to something Julian said earlier on, I think, about your professional knowledge and, knowing what is right for this child and knowing what, having the confidence to trust what you know, rather than feeling that you've got to have, some sophisticated system of recording stuff that somehow proves that they can do it, rather than actually using, your own knowledge of what you see those children do day after day after day, where you think, well, actually, they can do it sometimes, but not quite all the time yet. So I'm going to make sure they get a bit more practice, or no, actually, I'm confident they can do that. I've seen that. I know that they can do that. Let's move on.
And I think, Phil, the other thing to think about there is the fact that, the children who are coming in now, we're still early on in the term, in the academic year. And actually, rather than filling in pieces of paper about those children, it's about getting to know them.
Exactly. Really knowing those children, staff who know their children, where they are, what they can do, and what they need to do next.
And you know where to take them.
Yeah, that's the key. Where you want to get them by the end, in the long term, but it's also how well you know them. And we know that also that's a particularly important thing now, even more so after this period of lockdown and the changes that's had for children.
Okay.
The next slide is just a reminder, really a summary of the things that we've said, that assessment should be for a purpose. Assessment should, if you're going to do assessment, it should be telling you something that you won't know any other way, and it shouldn't be overburdensome. So there is clearly a role for assessment, and we don't say that that's not the case at all. Interestingly, when we're on inspection, we weren't asked to see it, and if you try to show us the assessments, we're actually not going to look at it. We've made that really clear. We don't want to be in any way a driver for overly complicated, overburdensome assessment approaches. But what we are really interested in is you telling us about what you know about your children. And that's all of our inspectors will be really interested in how, either like if you talk to us about an individual child, so you really know that child because you know them, or about what your evaluations and what you know about the cohort has told you about the curriculum. You may well be adjusting and changing the curriculum at the moment based on what you have learned about the children you've got in so far. So you're using your knowledge of the children to say, well, actually, we found out that they're not that secure in these things that usually the cohort would be in. So we're changing all of this, and we're all doing some of this because we think they need to. And equally, it might be that you've noticed one child who needs some extra support in a particular area. So the assessment shouldn't be just a sort of rolling program that takes away time. It should actually be for a purpose. And if you can't see the purpose in it, you'll find it difficult to explain that purpose to us, I think. You've got to really believe it. You shouldn't be doing anything for Ofsted. You should be doing it for the children, and then we'll be interested in it. You can see our interest in it as a byproduct of that valuable stuff that you do for your children.
I think just to conclude there really is that important message. We won't be wanting to look at don't do it for us because you think we want to see it, because we don't. And I don't think any of us went into early years to fill in coloured blocks on a spreadsheet.
Yeah, and you're not there to please us. You're not there to please Ofsted. You're there to meet the needs of those children. That's the fantastic and hugely important job that you do. And thank you for that, because that's what we want you to do. And then we're really interested when we come in to hear about it, but we don't need to see all the data. Okay, Julian, anything else? No, should we move on?
That's, yeah, sorry, I was a bit trigger happy there with my arrow key, so apologies for that. But thank you so much for that. And I can see that, people are wanting to submit some questions, but today is not a live Q&A event, because we've just pulled this together very quickly for all of you who are getting on as early adopters. But we will be working with the moderators of the group to collect together questions and to make sure you do get your queries answered. So I really want to echo what Wendy, Phil, and Ada have been saying, which is a huge tribute to all of you early adopters, the teachers, the early years educators, the TAs, all the people who are making this happen. And it's so great, really, just to be able to connect directly with what's going on for you. So I'm based in a nursery school in Newham and in East London. And I guess if I paint a picture of me, we're seeing those children over the road from us, literally going into reception, some of them really bouncing in and delighted to be back in school, others really finding those early days quite tricky. And similarly, in our provision for 2, 3, and 4-year-olds, I know how hard you're all working to make sure that you get to know the children and to settle them in. And so, of course, we've seen some very big questions coming from the group about what should you be doing during this first half term in autumn. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about in a moment. Just a very quick recap. The reason for the revision of the EYFS and what drove the rewrite of Development Matters is really these 4 key objectives: supporting children's communication better, because communication is so central to children's successful early learning, but it's also so central to their emotional well-being. And really, just to expand a little bit on what Phil said earlier and Wendy, which was so useful, is that of course it makes sense at the moment to put a real focus on helping children's communication. And we know the best way for you to do this is to be with the children, playing, chatting, sharing books. That's what's going to help their communication, not, and moving on to bullet point 2 here, a lot of unnecessary paperwork, which isn't core to what you're all really good at as teachers and early years educators, and can take you away from the children where you can really make a difference. The third key objective for the changes was specific guidance for the reception year. Reception teachers and leaders in schools told us that they wanted something that was more clearly to guide the curriculum in the reception year. And that's what the revised development matters is seeking to do. And finally, that crucial issue, and it's always been crucial for us, but it's so much more crucial than it's ever been now, which is around narrowing the gap. It's making sure that all children in the early years get that broad and balanced, rich and exciting curriculum that they're entitled to, and that they can make progress through that curriculum. And that children who may not have had such a great start to their early learning and development, through all the hard work that we do in the early years, they thrive, they access that curriculum, and over the medium and longer term, they catch up with other children. So those are the four those are the four kind of big picture reasons for these changes to EYFS. So that huge thank you to all of you who are doing this incredible work, but also thank you for the feedback you're giving us about development matters and the revised EYFS, which, as Ada says, is really your gift to the whole school sector, because you're trialing these approaches out this year so that the implementation for all schools next year will just be that much smoother and that much more straightforward for them. So we're huge thank you to all of you for being early adopters. I think it's always worth remembering what Becky Francis, CEO of the Education Endowment Foundation, said, which is once children fall behind, it's hard for them to catch up, and they are likely to fall further behind throughout school. So I'm always really positive and optimistic about things. And when I see Becky's slide, what it reminds me is that the early years is the part of our school system where high quality provision makes a big difference to disadvantaged children and other vulnerable learners. It's in early years that there's that real opportunity for children to overcome maybe some of their earlier difficulties in development and learning, and to do really well. So it's daunting because, like Becky says, once children fall behind, it's very hard for them to catch up. But it's also what we're really good at in early years. It's what all of you are really good at, which is supporting every child to thrive in their reception year. So I want to just talk for a moment about what I'm calling the curriculum progress model on this slide. And that's this, that the responsibility for the right curriculum for the reception year, that sits with all of you, the teachers, the early years educators, your senior leaders, your community. You're the people that know the children in the school. You know the strengths of the community to build on. You know the things that are difficult for children who come in. So you are the people to put together that curriculum, to know what sort of range of experiences it's particularly important for children to have. So for example, for us in East London, where a lot of our children live in overcrowded housing, it's super important for us to prioritize that they have a lot of time outdoors. We put a lot of time into things like forest school, an ambitious curriculum around children's physical development across nursery and reception, because that's something that it's really important for us to give our children. And you'll know, as I said, what the strengths in your community are, but also the things that schools can really make a difference around. The second thing to say about the curriculum is that within that big picture of what you want to help children learn and develop and get better at and know and remember, there has to be that progress model. So these are just examples. They shouldn't be taken as exemplars of what everyone should be doing, but you may well start off your reception year with an art area that has quite basic levels of equipment in it. So maybe you pre-mix the paints for the children to use. Maybe you just offer them a couple of types of paint brushes. Maybe you offer them 1 or 2 different types of paper to paint on. And as the year goes on, of course, you want all children to access those opportunities, and you want children to develop in their confidence and their skills as young painters. So you will be scaffolding some of the children who immediately turn lovely paints into kind of grey sludge by tipping everything in and mixing it all up together. And you'll be supporting and scaffolding them both to explore and get to know how paint mixes and how it behaves when you put it on the paper. But you'll also be scaffolding them around the sort of intentional colour mixing that you want children to do, so that they're noticing, say, the particular shade of green of the plant that you want them to paint, and they're working out how to mix the paints. And as the year goes on, the challenge will be growing. So you will maybe have a much wider range of paint brushes, so children can choose when to use something that's really fine and when to use a really big paintbrush. You will be maybe encouraging children to mix their own powder paints, to mix colours increasingly independently, and so on. So you've got that progress model as the year goes on. So you know that if you give the children all of those materials now, many of them are not really going to be ready to use all of those materials, but you know by the summer term that they will be. So within that big picture, that big progress model, all of the time as teachers and early years educators, we're scaffolding the children's learning, we're helping them, we're guiding them, we're supporting them, and making sure that all of the children are accessing those different opportunities. So it's through accessing that curriculum on a progress model that we know that children are making progress. And that is the importance of the next bullet point there, which is about secure learning, not filling in gaps, not setting out hundreds of next steps. So in other words, what you're checking is which children are really capably managing to do the things that you've set out for them to do, and which children maybe need a lot more help and a lot more practice. But at the end of the day, you want every child to take part in those activities and every child to make progress through that curriculum model. It's not about having 2 or 3 next steps for every child, which the next thing you know, in your class of 30, you've got 60 or 90 next steps to plan around. It's not about highlighting off all the different areas of development matters, because that can lead us to move children far too quickly from one experience to the next, rather than checking that their learning is secure. So where does development matters sit with that? Development matters sits in the background to help you map out that curriculum and check that it's broad and balanced, and check that it's ambitious for your children. It's there to guide you as you put together your big top level curriculum plan. It's not a curriculum, so you wouldn't expect to be highlighting off all the bits of development matters as the year goes on. And you have the professional judgment and expertise to take what's important, and also to know that there are other things that you're going to do a bit differently to how it's set out in development matters, which is guidance, not prescription. Inclusion is really important. So an inclusive curriculum means that every child thrives through your reception curriculum. Okay, some of them might need more support than others. Not all of them are going to make the degree of progress that others will make, but nevertheless, we're aiming for all children to access that curriculum. So for some children, they're going to need a lot of extra help, a lot of extra guidance. they may need some interventions that are quite targeted to give them the skills and the confidence they need, that they can then take back to the main activities you offer in your classroom so that they can take part like other children. And that's that ambition that we want every child to thrive. Really important, I think, in a lot of the research around curriculum is that the narrower it becomes and the more focused on targets it gets, the worse it is for disadvantaged children and children with SEND. So keeping that broad and balanced curriculum and helping every child to access it and helping every child to thrive, these are really important principles. Play is central to that. There's nothing in the revised statutory framework or development matters that suggests anything other than that play is central to the early years foundation stage and it's central to children's learning. Okay, but we've always been clear ever since the EPSI project reported to the Department for Education some years ago that in the early years, children need a mix of teaching and learning. They need some which is driven by them, follows their own interests and fascinations, but they also need guided learning where adults know what sort of extra skills or concepts children need to make progress and make sure that that's offered to them. And we also know from the research evidence that in the reception year, children need more of that adult guided learning than they need earlier in the EYFS. So again, this comes back to all of us as teachers to make that professional judgment about exactly what the right blend is for the children we're working with and getting that balancing act right. It's tricky, but that's what all of the people on this call are so good at, is understanding when to make those different judgments as we're teaching, as we're playing with children. And the final thing I'd say there is about the importance of continuous improvement. So it's making sure that we're always reviewing our curriculum in the light of how well children are doing. And if the curriculum isn't suitable for all children, then we are making modifications to it. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here focused on pedagogy because I think, again, one of the things that is obvious about early years when you work in it is that curriculum and pedagogy are really tightly bound up together. But I would just highlight here flexibility. We all know that your curriculum plan, broken down maybe into your weekly planning, doesn't mean that if children say lift up a log outside and find hundreds of woodlice there and are really fascinated in that, that you're going to stick to a plan that was for something else that day. We all know that we have to really fall in with the children's fascinations and interests. We often have to go with them. So much of the early years is about children's motivation and their own innate drive to learn and how we support that. But again, it's a balancing act, isn't it? Because if we entirely go with children's interests, there are two big dangers there. One is that if children have quite a narrow range of earlier interests, they just keep repeating that through the reception year, and that's not good for them. And the second problem is that there are some areas of knowledge in reception where the sorts of concept development children need to make, and I'm thinking here, for example, about early number and learning to count and being fluent in operating with small numbers. There are particular skills that children need and concepts they need, and it's not possible to introduce those to every child just through extending teachable moments. There is a really important role for adult guided learning, for thinking about all the different building blocks children need in some areas of the early years curriculum to make sure that they've got that secure understanding and that they're making progress. Characteristics of effective teaching and learning. So one of the changes in the new framework is that you're not required to report formally on that, i.e. in writing to parents at the end of the reception year. But that doesn't mean that it's not important. It's still both in the statutory framework and it's actually expanded in development matters now. because we know that the reception year and the early years in general, that's not just about what children learn, what they know and can do. It's also about helping them to build on their innate drive to learn and become more and more powerful learners through the opportunities that we give them. So the characteristics of effective teaching and learning remain extremely important with the EYFS. So some big questions have been raised on Facebook about tracking and checklists. So I'm just going to clarify something in development matters and then move on to what some of those questions are kind of pointing at. Because I know that the whole issue of assessing children at the moment is uppermost in people's minds in this early adopter year. So there are lots of problems involved with the approaches to tracking that have become a big part of the early years landscape. Let's just raise two obvious problems. The first one that's already been referenced a lot is that it can be very time consuming, and that takes your time away from being with the children, doing the things that will really make a difference. Or if you're putting a lot of time into it after the children have gone home, well, that's time you could be putting into really thinking about the children and their needs and what sort of environment and equipment and how you're going to make things work for the rest of the week for those children who are struggling. So it's problematic from a workload point of view, but it's also problematic because a lot of that data is really what I would call dodgy data. So it's very difficult to make accurate assessments of children's level of development, especially when they're just new in reception year, and you're trying to do that across all of these different areas of learning. And there are big questions that haven't been satisfactorily answered, like what's the difference between secure 30 to 50 and emerging 40 to 60? So we end up with this complicated set of data, which is actually quite questionable. So Development Matters has been written to dissuade everyone from doing that. And I guess one of our pleas is don't take the new Development Matters and try and turn it into the old one. Look at the early years afresh, because that is the terrific opportunity you've got as early adopters, is to look at this fresh and think it through again from first principles. There are some checkpoints in the prime areas in Development Matters. Those aren't intended to be turned into a tick list and used for all children. The reason they're there is that if practitioners are a bit unsure about what some of those big milestones look like in children's development, they can use Development Matters to guide them. If you needed maybe to have a focused conversation with a parent about something that a child was having difficulty with, the checkpoint might help you. But what's not necessary is to take those out of Development Matters and use them as a tick list for all of the children. So we've already heard about what it says in the statutory framework about not having prolonged breaks from interaction with children. And so what I do want to say before just looking at a few of the specific questions that have arisen is something about high quality assessment. So the first thing I'd say is that the large majority of the assessment we all do never gets written down anywhere. It's that minute-to-minute decision about which child needs help, when we stand back and let a child have a go at something, when we're around and encouraging but not interfering, when we notice that a child really does need us to teach them to do something like, say, cut with scissors, so that they can do the thing they really want to do, which is, say, make a mask. So we're assessing all of the time. And most of that stuff isn't written down and recorded anywhere. And a lot of the best use we make of that is the feedback we give to children. So that feedback where we're saying to children, wow, you're getting on really well with that. Just keep on going, just keep trying. Or maybe you should just stop for a moment and have another look there and think about a different way to do that. So that feedback to children is really useful. It's important to include children's voices and reflections in assessment because we know that that is a way that children become more powerful learners. So if you're able to get children, for example, round about the week before half term to have conversations with you that focus on things like, well, when I came in, I found that really difficult, but now I can do it. That will build their confidence as learners, and that metacognition is very powerful for young children. Parents need to be involved in high quality assessment, and high quality assessment should be inclusive. So there's always been this strong focus on data and baselining, but I just wanted to take us away from that for a minute and think about the qualities that we might be looking for in the early years. And I think Phil and Wendy used this term earlier, which is we're not so much baselining the children here, we're getting to know 30 little people who are having their first experience in big school with all of the excitement and fears and wobbles and ups and downs that that entails. That's really what we're all doing at the moment. So here are some of the questions that have been arising. So how should we be baselining children, and what sort of data should we be making available? And what I want to encourage everyone to do is not think about baselining and data here, but think about getting to know the children. Think about who are the children in your class who are struggling to access your reception curriculum, and what are you going to do about that? What's the extra help you're going to give those children? It could be that you give them a bit more time and attention, or that you have a longer conversation with their parents about maybe some of the early difficulties those children are having. Or you might want to look at the record that was passed on from their nursery and see how things look for that child's learning journey. And you're pulling together all of that information so that you're responding in the best possible way to help those children access the reception curriculum. And a small number of them might have higher needs than you can manage in your team. And that, of course, is where the Senko and other people start to get involved. But we also really know that child who struggles at the beginning of the reception year and you're a little bit worried about them, but actually once they find their feet, they're doing fine. So you're using your process of getting to know your new children to identify children who might need some extra help, but we're also remembering that that could be temporary. So we're not considering those our kind of bottom 20% group or any other term that might set a ceiling on how well those children will do in reception. We're just saying that at the moment, these are the children who need a bit of extra support and help. There isn't any requirement or implication anywhere in the reformed EYFS or in development matters that that information should be turned into data. There just isn't. But it is useful to share with senior leaders, of course, which children are having difficulties as they start in reception, and how you're communicating with parents and what sort of support that you're putting in. And so hopefully you can have those early celebrations of those children beginning to find their feet and to succeed in their early learning. So then that would take us on to the question of how are we going to monitor progress? And again, I want to take everyone back to that earlier concept of the curriculum model is a progress model. So if children are fully engaged in the curriculum and you've got a progress model, then children are making progress. You've got some children that you're giving extra help to, and you know exactly where you're targeting that extra help. And you're spending more of your assessment time checking that what you're doing is helping those children to access the curriculum than you are gathering lots of information about children who are thriving and doing well in your classroom. So in other words, you're putting your efforts where they're going to make the most difference. There, again, isn't any implication in the revised statutory framework or the revised development matters that there is a way of predicting which children are on track to achieve the ELG and which children are not on track. So again, to try and echo what Phil and Wendy were saying earlier, we don't want to focus the reception year on the early learning goals. The early learning goals are not the reception curriculum. They're an important indicator of how ready children are for the demands of the Key Stage 1 curriculum, and which children may need help at that point of transition. And it's important that the curriculum and the expectations that we have for children are ambitious. But given the choice between focusing all our efforts on helping children jump through those 17 hoops, or giving all children a really sound, rich, balanced, broad, exciting curriculum that helps them make progress step by step, make sure that children have enough time for their learning to be secure. You know, we have to go for that second model, don't we? Because that's what gives children really good foundations for their later learning. It's no good putting a lot of effort into getting a child through an early learning goal hoop if they don't really understand or know those things, and are just going to struggle them all over again in year 1. And the more we focus on meaningless targets associated with the ELGs, the less helpful that assessment information is. So in other words, if we put huge efforts to coaxing children through an ELG target, that assessment isn't helpful in year 1, because it gives the year 1 teacher a misleading impression of how secure that child's learning is. But it also doesn't help us in reception, because in reception we need to reflect on which bits of our curriculum are we teaching well, and which bits maybe need a bit more revision and improvement next year. So the early learning goal assessment data is one of the bits of information we can use to help us reflect on our reception curriculum. Now, I really understand that sense in senior leadership that we feel very accountable for children doing well, and we feel very accountable that provision is high quality and that children are making progress, especially disadvantaged children. So it's entirely understandable and right that senior leadership teams in schools are very focused on those important questions. But the implication of the revised EYFS and the revised development matters is that the high quality provision is about how well constructed that curriculum is, your enabling environment, and how well it's supported by the care and the pedagogy. That's what high quality provision is about. And that is a really important aspect of monitoring how effective early years is. Progress is the curriculum model. So are children accessing that curriculum and making progress? Are children who need extra help getting that extra help? That's where we can make sure and be absolutely accountable to parents and other stakeholders that our EYFS is working for the children we're responsible for. So I'm going to finish now really with this call to action, which is to say that we've got a fantastic workforce of teachers and early years educators out there. And really at this particular moment, it's humbling to see what reception practitioners are doing to help children, some of whom have had a very difficult period in their young lives, to get them positively back into school and playing and learning with others. And what you're doing is remarkable and life-changing for a lot of the children. A lot of the revised EYFS and the revised development matters sits on top of the fact that we know that we have a fantastic workforce, those expert teachers, those expert early years educators who are highly professional. And where we need to put our efforts is in making sure, first of all, that there is that focus on ongoing professional development. And secondly, that ambition that development matters is really the floor for everybody. This is what we should all be doing, but it is not the ceiling for everybody. We've all got our own ambitions for the children we're working with that go well beyond what's set out in Development Matters. And that is a big part of the reason for Development Matters being so much shorter than its predecessor. It's not to reduce the expectations, it's to say, let's declutter this space so there's more of a space for you as teachers and early years educators to be ambitious for the children and to do the right thing for the children who are in your schools and in your classes. So I really see this as a fantastic opportunity for the teaching profession, for the early years educators, for the TAs that are so committed with the children, to do the right thing for the children that we're working with, to make sure that we're giving them that ambitious, broad, balanced curriculum, to stop narrowing the curriculum on a small number of early learning goals, and to be far more ambitious for the children we're working with than just that short list. And I guess what I want to say is that when you read things in the introduction to Development Matters, that they're for real. So when you see what it says about assessment and data and tracking, that's been very deliberately put there. Now, it may feel like a big break from what we're all used to, but this is our opportunity to reflect as professionals on what's best for the children and how we can really make sure that all of our children thrive in the early years, and that we especially seize that opportunity to make sure that disadvantaged children have a fabulous and supportive time for their learning and their personal development in the early years, so that they're really well set to thrive as they move through the schools that we're working in. So I hope that between us, from DFE and Ofsted, and then from a Development Matters point of view, we've painted you some of the picture about what this change to the EYFS means, and also that clarity about the myths that still buzz around Ofsted and inspection. And I think Wendy and Phil have done a terrific job there to clear up some of those. We will be back with you, and we look forward to engaging you in this exciting journey that you're on as early adopters. And I'd really, again, just like to thank you all. So I'm just going to very briefly hand back to Wendy and Phil from Ofsted and Ada from the DFE, and then we'll finish today's event, but we will be coming back with more support for all of you. So maybe if I can hand over to Ada first.
I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank you for spending your time this afternoon listening to this, and I hope that it's been helpful. No doubt you do have some questions on things that we've said, and as Julian says, you know, if those could be collated, then we can have a look at getting some answers back to you on anything that wasn't clear enough or you wanted more information on. And also, as Julian says, this won't be the end of information and support that we will be trying to give.
Okay, and thank you, Ada. Thank you so much for at very short notice coming to support this event. And Wendy and Phil.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for listening. I think just that final message from us would be that, you know, at this time, do what's right for your children, get to know them, and don't do anything that you think, you know, don't do something because you think it might be something that Ofsted wants to see, because it isn't.
Okay, and I think a really big thank you at this point to Vic and everyone else who've put in so much time to creating this Facebook group. And I know you're not all people with a whole heap of spare time. So the fact that Vic and colleagues have invested their own time into setting this up, I think is fantastic. And we look forward to being back with you again soon. And Vic and the moderators will be looking at questions that you've got to make sure that we can have a Q&A type format of some sort sooner rather than later for everyone. But for now, a really big thank you to everyone and goodbye.